This is episode 7 of the LatinNews podcast. I'm Richard McCall, your host here in Bogota, Colombia. My very special guest this week is Diego von Vacano. He's a professor of political science at Texas A&M University in the United States, and we're talking lithium, Bolivia, instability, polarization, and just about anything else Bolivia related. Can I just say welcome on the LatinNews podcast?
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time and invitation.
No. The pleasure is ours because it's something very special to get someone on the podcast, on this episode, to discuss lithium, to discuss Bolivia trying to industrialize its vast lithium reserves. And I just want to get out there quickly, like I read in El País newspaper, you have been advising, well, informally, the Arce government, the president's party on lithium. So, who better to tell us what's going on? I mean, let's start with the most basic here. How can Bolivia industrialize its lithium reserves to boost development? This is a poor country.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's Bolivia has the largest deposits in the world, so definitely. Not only for Bolivia would it be a major change, but also for the lithium industry generally. So the question that you asked, I think, Bolivia doesn't have the technology, it doesn't have the capacity, the human development necessary for the industry. So it has to work with foreign partners. That's definitely the only way. And of course, there's three major players in the industry. That's China, the U.S. and to some extent Russia interested in Bolivia, and I think the best path forward is for Bolivia to work with all of them. That's one solution. Some European companies could also be involved, but at this stage, none of the finalists are European companies in terms of the direct lithium extraction. So Bolivia has to find a way to change the constitution or to change some of the laws that would allow for foreign investment and foreign technology to come into Bolivia. That's the general short answer to your question.
Okay, but if we're changing laws, what kind of laws are we looking at that the Bolivia needs to change?
So the constitution doesn't allow for foreign companies to extract the lithium. So only the state is allowed to extract because it's a national resource. It's nationalized. And so there would have to be people have been working on this, a lithium law in Bolivia to allow this type of partnership. And this should have happened about a year ago already. And it's been in the works really for more than almost a year and a half. And so that's the major law that has to be changed to allow this intervention or participation of foreign firms. Because again, Bolivia just doesn't have the capacity. The Bolivian National Lithium Company, YLB, is almost broke. Basically, they don't have money even for salaries, and so it's a very, very critical situation. And unless there's this change in the lithium law, there could be potential for less than transparent things to go on in terms of how YLB will get money again for salaries and even just basic operations. So again, that's the first step. This law has to be changed. The other thing I think is that the focus on China has to be, even though of course China dominates the lithium sector generally, Bolivia has to talk to more partners. And that's something a little bit surprising that it's been taking so long for Bolivia to even come to an agreement with the Russian company Uranium One, which for a long time, Uranium One is a state-owned company, a subsidiary of Rosatom. And Bolivia has had very good relations with Russia for a very long time, even before the Ukraine war. So in a sense, it's logical for Russia to have a participation as well, but that's also taking a long time, and it's unclear why that's the case. And the third player is the U.S., and there's some firms that are still participating, hoping to get at least an agreement, because so far the talks with the Chinese company, it's a consortium led by CATL, which is the largest battery maker in the world. So far, that's just an agreement. It's not a contract. So even that itself is worrisome, problematic, because it's not a contract. Nothing has been put into place. And so obviously Bolivia needs to have more contracts and for things to actually happen on the ground.
I mean, okay, so we've got these three big players, obviously. The US looking to make its mark once again. Obviously, not the favorite for Bolivian governments of late. China seems to be leading, I think, as you say, and then Russia. So Bolivia now is at the fore of another geopolitical puzzle that's taking place. How do you see this panning out?
Yeah, Bolivia again. This as you well know, Bolivia goes through these cycles of being at the center of these global storms, in a sense. From the gas war, the water war, and now it's possible that if things are not resolved, there could be civil unrest in 6 months or a year. That could be something like a lithium war, because again, if the government doesn't show that it's moving forward, then a lot of the social groups are going to be there might be some types of uprisings again, like in the past. So I think China definitely has the upper hand. I mean, but that's something that's been happening in the industry for over 20 years. The U.S. is really behind. The U.S. Doesn't really have much of a plan towards Bolivia, especially towards, there's no ambassador in Bolivia. There's no formal diplomatic relations. As you said, a lot of the Bolivian population is very wary, and of course, rightly so, of the U.S., of U.S. firms, the government. Some declarations by some U.S. military about lithium specifically, and as you may know, some of the comments that even Elon Musk made about Bolivian lithium and also Evo Morales. So all these things have created a sort of negative image of the U.S. government, U.S. companies, and of course that's a little bit tragic, because in a sense some of the best technology comes from the U.S. and the U.S. could be one of Bolivia's partners. I think that was one of the ideas that we had when I was advising Arce around 2019. During the election, I arranged meetings with American universities, some American entrepreneurs, etc., interested in sharing their technology. And so Luis Arce was very open to working with U.S., Western, and European partners then. But it's in the last 2 years, I think he's changed his strategy to be much less open to those type of partnerships.
Do you think this strategy is somewhat due to the divisions, the internal and very public now divisions in the mass party itself? Do you think he's had to sort of roll back a little bit? Because I mean, you did mention the civil unrest and social unrest. It does happen a lot. I mean, more than in other places in Bolivia. Yeah. People are very quick to, let's say, block the highway between Sucre and La Paz and so on, and the divide in the country between Santa Cruz de la Sierra and the Altiplano. It is a very polarized country, and the populist rhetoric, it's very powerful.
Yeah, exactly. As you know, in a sense, the ultimate deciding factor for lithium in Bolivia is really the domestic politics, I think. So I think if the U.S. or any other country wants to really, in a sense, get a hold of some of Bolivia's lithium or buy it or some other in some kind of partnership, they have to understand Bolivian domestic politics. And again, like I said, I was very surprised in the last 3 years when I talked to people from the U.S. Embassy in Bolivia, or especially American analysts, or they really don't know anything about Bolivia, and they don't really have much interest. That's another problem, is that some of the people that go to work in Bolivia in the embassy, etc., are not really there willingly. I mean, they get assigned there, and they don't really want to even learn much about the culture, the history of Bolivia. And so that causes a huge rift between the two countries. And it's almost impossible to explain to them why some of these protests exist. Again, in Potosí, Santa Cruz, and of course the big powder keg right now would be in Potosí. That's where Comcipo and other civic organizations that are generally against the mass party, the ruling party, the Socialist Party, they could rise up and protest against the lack of participation that they have. They're very rare, infrequent meetings with the government. So there's very few stakeholder meetings. That's something that I also suggested a long time ago, but it's very infrequent when the government meets with the stakeholders, indigenous communities in Potosí. So again, especially COMCIPO is the Civic Committee of Potosí, and that they might very well block almost anything or call for mass protests and blockades. And as you mentioned, also Santa Cruz, which is in the eastern part of Bolivia, and it's basically the equivalent of Texas. It's Santa Cruz is like a very conservative cattle and oil state, departamento, much more right-wing conservative, where the natural gas, a lot of the natural gas is located. And they're also historically very anti-mass, even though during the Evo administration, they did very well economically. But the political culture of Santa Cruz is very conservative and very much against La Paz. So there's a couple of different areas of Bolivia that could very well, at the very least, block things or create massive unrest if the government doesn't figure out this puzzle.
And it is a complex puzzle, and I just keep coming back to the idea of foreign companies and their technology coming into to Bolivia. Obviously, as you say, it seems incongruous that Bolivia has all this lithium and the state company is broke, but of course the technology doesn't exist, so Bolivia requires the investment. But the Bolivian state takes the biggest share of revenue from oil and gas companies, behind Mexico. Is this really conducive to attracting more investment in Bolivia?
Yeah, the natural gas model that was used under Evo administration, generally, even after the so-called nationalization, it worked. It was the driving engine for the increasing GDP, reducing poverty by over 30%. The extreme poverty was reduced by 30%. So in general, it worked. The so-called nationalization, in which 51% of shares are held by the state. And this is after some of these companies were kicked out, and then they came back in because they knew Bolivia would still be a good market for the extraction of gas. So in a sense, you could try something similar with lithium, because of the sheer amount of Bolivian lithium. That's something that would be a game changer for the global market. So I think it's possible to convince some of these companies, especially some of the larger ones. And I think that's why CATL, the consortium that they're leading, they're willing to do that, because they're big enough that they could take the risk financially and also create the infrastructure that's necessary in Uyuni and Coipasa, Pastos Grandes, the other salars. So I think it's possible, but I think there has to be some incentives and different frameworks developed, I think, for each country, because if the U.S. wanted to be involved, or if Bolivia wanted to involve the U.S. or Russia, they all have different objectives in a sense. And I think for that to work out, the government would have to make it clear what those arrangements would be, those agreements. But so far, everything is kind of stalled with the CATL agreement, the consortium with China. A couple of days ago, Luis Arce announced a meeting with executives, but that meeting itself doesn't say anything new. It just confirms that CATL is interested in developing Bolivia's lithium. By June, they should have shown the results of the pilot tests that purportedly they carried out in Uyuni. And so that hasn't been shown, and that's also surprising. That should have been made public, and this kind of raises again the question of why there's been such a lack of transparency in terms of the entire process from the beginning. And so I think if the process had been more transparent, people would have been more able to see why a certain company is included, some are excluded, in what ways the stakeholders could have more involvement, etc. So I think that's also one of the major flaws, this lack of transparency, especially given that the process is really led by very few people at YLB and the Ministry of Energy.
This lack of transparency seems to be following a trend. We know, and it's well reported, well covered, the economic difficulties that Bolivia suffers, the shortage of US dollars, which, there's been no publishing of these figures by the central bank since February of 2023, and now you say that there's been no publication of the tests in Uyuni. I mean, this seems to be a government policy now.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it is. I mean, I think again, there's a big change in from the first year of the Luis Arce government administration, in which things were, I think, more technocratic, more open, more transparent, more, in a sense, cosmopolitan, in the sense that he was trying to work with almost anybody in the world. And I think, in large part, because of the tensions with the internal tensions within the party, perhaps with some of the Evo Morales group, there was a retrenchment and a kind of a fear of becoming of losing power. And so I think the fear of losing power has become the central dominating, in a sense, emotion or sentiment in the administration. And so that's been the focus of almost everything, again, to maintain power and to keep it, and to share as little information as possible so that it doesn't create problems for the government. I've seen that, over about 2 years. I think it's almost like I would call it almost like a political paranoia, because even very small things become, for them, seem to be problematic, and they're afraid that it's going to undermine the government. And so I think that has led a huge change in the culture within the administration. And so when Bolivia started to have this dollar deficit, by that time, Bolivia hadn't really developed a lithium strategy. So that's another thing. Luis Arce never was able to develop a clear lithium strategy that could be shared with the people of Bolivia, the citizens. And so again, the whole process has been marred by this lack of transparency, even for the criteria. Again, for why certain companies are included, some were excluded, whether they actually had those test results at labs, whether it's in Uyuni, or because only one company actually had the pilot plant in Uyuni. The other ones received the samples of brine, Bolivian brine, back in their countries, in China, etc. So again, purportedly, because again, there's no evidence of them having received those samples, right? So again, even the technical elements are not visible to the public, and so I think this has created a lot of uncertainty, skepticism, and I think the Evo Morales group, or the wing of the party, has realized that this is a major misstep by the Arce government, and is really now, in the last 4 or 5 months, trying to, in a sense, exploit that weakness.
It's a fascinating situation. Unfortunately, those who suffer most are the Bolivian people. The companies obviously investing or wishing to invest have a strong belief in the return on their investment, obviously. And I just think that, obviously, the term you use, the political paranoia by the government of Luis Arce, it sort of heralds back to how Jeanette, remind me of her surname, Agnes. Jeanette Agnes gained power through, such tenuous links to being in government. So I guess that there's a very real fear. But I have to ask then, I mean, we've got the Evo Morales side of the mass party, the Evistas. Is he going to run again in 2025?
It's very likely. It's very likely that he's going to be running. Every day there's discussion about how that can happen, or how even Luis Arce could be even excluded from the primary of the mass party. So there's discussions about this pretty much every day in the last few weeks. But yeah, Evo Morales will very likely be a candidate. There'll be he's still, I think, as you mentioned before, I mean, this is a phenomenon all over Latin America, the caudillo, the one strong man leader, which has positive and negative elements. I mean, in Latin American history, the wars against Spanish imperialism were led by caudillo. So in a sense, that's a positive side of the caudillo tradition. But of course, it's a double-edged sword, because in the end, you also have elimination of opposition, and so you don't have as many people competing for power. It becomes less competitive, and so power becomes more concentrated, centralized. But it is true also that a lot of the achievements of the mass party, especially in the first 10 years between 2006 2016, were really created by decisions made by Evo Morales, especially the economy, but also transformation of the culture. And there was a lot of racism in Bolivia. I would also almost call it almost like an apartheid state, apartheid culture in the 1970s and 80s, even in the 90s. And then that began to change when Morales came to power. So again, there's definitely a lot of positive things that Morales has done, and perhaps the mass movement is indeed connected almost intimately with him. I mean, if he once he disappears, then maybe the movement will disappear. So it's a little bit similar to situation maybe in Cuba with Fidel Castro and other caudillos, in the sense that they're synonymous with the movement. But at this point, given some your comparison with Janet with Áñez and Janine Áñez and Arce, I think it's telling, because a lot of people in Bolivia are making that comparison. They're saying that Arce really power fell on his lap almost coincidentally, and it got to his head. It sort of, he became enamored with power. And I think in a way that Janine Áñez also that she experienced that, and she didn't do a good job in that 1 year. So that's why a substantial number of people are calling for the return of Evo Morales, because they remember the relative stability, relative growth of the first 10 years of his government. But unfortunately, there's no other really major figure, especially indigenous figure. Given that Bolivia is mostly indigenous, there's not that many indigenous political leaders, and in part that's because Evo Morales was able to kind of eliminate them, through political strategies and stratagems to get them out of the picture. He's a very able, very smart political actor, and so he was able to really become the only indigenous leader. And so there's some people like Andrónico, who's the head of the Senate, and but he's still very young. And I think he's very smart, and I think he might be able to be a potential leader or president in the future. But again, the figure of Evo Morales really looms large over the country.
That's right. I mean, he's left an indelible mark and print on the country, and I think, I mean, would he be held in higher regard had he stepped away when it was his time? Or are people forgetting that now? Are people forgetting, that selective memory to think, oh, well, it was better under him?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of people would say that his image would have been much better if he had stepped. He would not have run for re-election. He ignored the referendum, and I think once he ignored the referendum, he lost a lot of political capital, especially in the cities, especially middle class people who voted for him in the cities, mestizos, people who are more mixed with Spanish or European descent, who voted for him because of the need for economic transformation. And so he had a lot of supporters back in the early or the mid 2000s, but he lost a lot of that because of that, ignoring the referendum. And I think that's still going to be a problem for him if he runs in 2025. I think a lot of people will remember that that was not a good decision, and they will think that, well, he's still trying to consolidate power in himself, and so I don't think people are going to forget. But again, just the lack of options is really a factor. And again, the opposition, like with Carlos Mesa, is very weak. The Camacho is in jail. Áñez is in jail, and so people have said that this is a result of a political persecution, right, by the Arce government. In my opinion, that's not really the case, given that they supported what I think was basically a coup d'etat, in my view, because the military were involved in kind of asking, quote unquote, asking Evo to step down. But there's been a lot of political time spent on this debate of whether there was a coup or whether there was a fraud in Bolivia in 2019. And to me, that's really a waste of time, because we're losing energy and time on something that already happened, and Bolivia should be focused on again trying to develop the lithium resources, which are, if that happened, that would really completely transform the country into something that would be much more modern.
Well, it seems like these are effective digressions for the Arce government while it flounders in this situation. I wanted to go more into the accusations of the Evistas, the Morales supporters. Obviously we keep coming back to the fact that Bolivia does not have the technology, Bolivia doesn't have the know-how, and so Arce is being pragmatic, we'd say, looking for approval for loans from the IDB, the World Bank, CAF, and so on. But the Evistas are obviously saying that he's subjugating Bolivia to the evil empire. I don't know how you play off this.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is a step back by Arce to seek help from multilateral organizations, etc., because that's not really within the culture of the Mass Party. So the Mass, I mean, obviously, it's a socialist party. It was elected on a platform to remain sort of, at the very least, critical of these mostly Western-based organizations or banks, the IMF, the World Bank, etc. When Evo cut ties with the U.S., with the DEA, in the end, I think generally they tended to be the decisions that actually helped Bolivian sovereignty. I think that actually there were good decisions. But so when Arce is trying this rapprochement with some of these U.S. or Western organizations, that's going to it's gonna be seen as negative by a lot of the base, a lot of the rank and file of the mass, and just the average Bolivian is still is poor and indigenous, right? So, and especially given that Luis Arce himself is not indigenous, they see him almost as somebody who is benefiting from the mass movement and the Evo Morales legacy, and he should have just been a sort of an interim president to smooth things out. So I think yeah, a lot of the base is very, very critical of this move to work with Western banks, etc. And that's something that undercuts some of the steps that were made by Morales during his administration. So that's why some people are saying that it's a turn to the right. It's veering right, and ideologically doesn't have much consistency with the mass party platform.
Certainly a difficult situation to be leading the mass, and yes, of course, not being an indigenous figure, a character larger than life, of course, like Evo Morales. And winding this down, I'm going to throw a question out there as well. There's always the question. Say that we get to 2025, Morales, or maybe, well, no, Morales wins, and starts putting in, or backing unconditionally Chinese, Russian investment, and turning his back on maybe the US a bit more. I mean, it's want to happen. Can we see some sort of, I don't know, political or economic, some sort of silent intervention from the United States in Bolivia?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it'd be naive to think that the US is beyond this type of intervention. I mean, the U.S. has intervened in Latin America many times, sometimes openly, sometimes covertly. And again, I think that for the lithium resources to be available to the West, there has to be a huge transformation in the way that the U.S. looks at Bolivia. In Latin America generally, of course, but Bolivia specifically, it has to stop seeing it as its backyard. I mean, that's definitely it would make a big difference for a lot of Bolivians if they actually saw this change in the rhetoric and the practice of the U.S. towards Bolivia. Even just things like creating scholarships for students to study lithium-related industries. In general, again, a move to try to have a more equal partnerships, seeing each other eye to eye and not looking down on Bolivia, which has been historically the case. So yeah, I think the U.S., unless that happens, the U.S. is going to be excluded from these riches. And if Morales comes back, I think Morales actually is much more, in a sense, more pragmatic. Again, the economy grew very, very fast. There were a lot of French and Spanish companies in gas. He worked very well with entrepreneurs from Santa Cruz. He used to meet with entrepreneurs all the time. Arce hasn't done that, even though he's an economist and he was educated in Britain for his master's degree. He's not shown much openness or willingness to talk to entrepreneurs and capitalists in the way that Evo actually did. And so I think it might be possible to convince Evo that even if you might prefer to work with Chinese companies, which again, even beyond the political aspect, China dominates the sector, lithium. So it's almost inevitable, right, that they would have to work with China, with Chinese companies, etc. It might be possible to convince them to work with some U.S. companies which have good technology, which may help and create better ties with universities in the U.S., educational scholarships, etc. So I think I've seen a little of a much more pragmatic approach by Evo. If you look back in the last 10, 15 years, it's not impossible. I think at the same time, there's more and more cases of corruption in the Arce government. Different, even ministers have resigned from their positions. Even the son of the president is involved in many serious accusations within the national oil company, and his involvement in the lithium sector as well. And Arce is not talking about that. I think Arce should be very open about it and say, look, yeah, let's deal with this issue. Bolivia is much bigger than these personal family issues, and he should deal with that with problems of nepotism directly. But he doesn't do that. He's completely ignoring those issues of corruption. Just today or yesterday, there was some talk about setting up anti-corruption mechanisms, but this is very, very superficial. So again, to the extent that he doesn't really deal with them seriously, Evo has a bigger chance. And yes, I mean, he will probably go with the Chinese, but again, I think there's still a window of opportunity for Americans and Europeans. Again, it's a little bit surprising why very few European companies have been interested or involved, maybe because the political risk is so high in Bolivia, but very few British, French, Germans have actually tried to get involved in the Bolivian lithium sector. I think that would be really good if there was a second round for like DLE or extraction. It would be really good to have a couple of European partners, because then that would open the European market much more for Bolivia. And there's different ways to do this. I mean, but maybe Bolivia can actually either sell the lithium or there's maybe even lease it. There's some precious minerals that are being leased, and that maybe that's a mechanism that Bolivia could retain the property rights over the lithium, but still be able to get money from them. So I think, again, Evo or whoever comes next has to be much more creative and open-minded. And again, I think Bolivia has enough of the resource globally that Bolivia could be the one deciding how to do this. And that's the major opportunity that I think is being missed right now by Arce.
Yeah. Well, fantastic and so very interesting. I mean, there is a way forwards, and it obviously requires transparency and coherency. That's what I'm getting from this. And it seems to me, with this extractive industries in Bolivia no longer crossed off the map. It's Bolivia is very much a player for this market. So let me take this moment to say thank you so much to Professor Diego von Vacano, Professor of Political Science at Texas A&M University. It has been enlightening discussing this with you. And well, here's hoping for the best for Bolivia in, some very pivotal decisions coming up.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, it's a lot of things are happening in Bolivia, and I think the world is going to have there'll be an impact on the world because of the industries. It requires much more lithium, and I think Bolivia, if it gets its act together, they can really change the industry. So thank you very much.
You're most welcome. I've been Richard McCall here in Bogota, Colombia, and this has been episode 7 of the Latin News podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and bye-bye.